For the last lecture of week 8, I just have a kind of a quick little lecture here I wanted to put together about the ovarian cycle, menstrual cycle in a female, and how that contributes. It is necessary to go over this to talk about the endocrinology of the reproductive system, whereas males, it was quite simple. So let's just recap here. So remember that oocytes, the eggs, and the follicles develop simultaneously, and the tertiary follicle with the secondary oocyte is what is going to ovulate and release that egg into the uterine tube and travel to hopefully meet the sperm. This is all dependent upon FSH. So FSH is necessary for follicle development, and that egg will mature as well. That also, FSH also promotes androgen secretion, and androgens in the female are going to be your estrogen and your progesterone, and they're very important for developing that uterus to house a developing embryo potentially, as well as sustain pregnancy. And LH, on the other hand, is necessary for the ovulation phase to release that egg from the follicle. And then don't forget about gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is released from the hypothalamus, which allows the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH will then tell the ovaries to make estrogen and progesterone. Those two are made in the uterus. So menstruation, a menstrual cycle is basically a regular recurring change in the endometrium of the uterus, that inner lining of the uterus. It's monthly, it's normal, it needs to happen in order to maintain fertility. The first menstrual cycle of a female's life is called menarche, and that is when her reproductive system is now mature and able to become pregnant. Also, her body becomes responsive to hormones. So her body is now very responsive to FSH and LH, as well as estrogens. And when her body becomes receptive to estrogens, that is when puberty, secondary sexual characteristics begin to start. Pubic hair, breast development, other body hair, smells, things like that. And something else I want to note is that estrogen and progesterone work inversely to LH and FSH, kind of like with testosterone, LH and FSH. So these things work inversely to one another. Usually when one goes up, the other goes down. There is a negative feedback, but there is a case of positive feedback here that we're going to talk about. So the sexual cycle can ultimately be housed under two phases. There's a follicular phase and there's a luteal phase. The follicular phase is day 1 to 14 of the menstrual cycle. The luteal phase is the rest up until day 28. And this is based on a 28-day cycle. Now, females have very different lengths of cycles, but this is for a 28-day cycle. So during day 1 to 14, we have menstruation, and we also have follicular growth. The first day of the menstrual cycle is the first day of the menstrual period. So as soon as that menstruation starts to happen, that day 1, that is day 1 of your cycle. At day 14 is when ovulation happens. And then at day 28, back into day 1, then you should start your next period. So during 1 to 14, you have menstruation happening in the very beginning. But as you approach day 14, we have to grow that follicle into a tertiary follicle, Graafian follicle, in order to ovulate an egg. During the luteal phase, ovulation has happened, and that follicle begins to release some hormones that are going to help sustain pregnancy, like progesterone. And then the endometrium is going to thicken and become nice and cushy and cozy for a potential implantation of a zygote, which is a fertilized egg. But if fertilization does not occur, then menstruation happens again, and that cycle all starts over again. So during the ovarian cycle, let's talk about what's happening in the ovaries first, and then we'll talk about what's happening in the uterine lining. So in the ovaries, we have a follicular phase from day 1 to 14. So that is the developing follicle into that mature follicle here. That is based upon sustained levels of FSH and rising levels of estrogen and progesterone. As estrogen and progesterone rise, that's going to inhibit FSH. But at here about right before ovulation, estrogen is going to drop immensely. And so that will trigger a spike in LH, because remember, they're working inversely of each other. There's a little bit of a spike in FSH again, but not as much. So essentially what happens here during the follicular phase is FSH is secreted for most of it, and then it's going to taper off, and your estrogen and progesterone are going to increase, and then those will drop off, and then you're going to have the surge of LH at day 14. And that's the key here to ovulation, is that surge in luteinizing hormone that causes this to happen, that rupture of the follicle and release of the egg. After ovulation, LH drops off, FSH is also dropped off, because estrogen and progesterone are sustained in very high levels, and estrogen and progesterone are the pregnancy hormones. So think about what happens after ovulation. The goal is that that egg that was just released meets up with the sperm, is fertilized and creates a zygote and then an embryo. And so estrogen and progesterone need to be sustained at high levels in anticipation of that happening. So again, at day 14, 14 days after the start of your period should be your ovulation, give or take a couple days. The follicle pops, essentially releases that fluid as well as the egg, and then the fimbriae and the cilia sweep that egg into the uterine tube, and then hopefully fertilization occurs in the uterine tube. If not, then the egg is swept into the uterus and is just secreted in the menses with the next menstrual period. During the luteal phase, the follicle becomes something called the corpus luteum. So that is what I was kind of talking about in the last lecture here. This corpus luteum is responsible for secreting progesterone. Progesterone keeps that uterus nice and comfy and developed for the potential of an implantation. But if fertilization does not occur after so many days, then that corpus luteum will deteriorate. And when that deteriorates, then our progesterone levels are going to drop off. And as the progesterone levels dropped off, the estrogen levels are also going to drop off, which then will increase again our FSH and LH, because remember, as one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. All right, so again, the follicle becomes something called the corpus luteum, releases those pregnancy hormones to prepare the uterine wall for potential implantation. But if not, then it degrades, and then the estrogen and progesterone drop off, and then our FSH becomes higher again to stimulate the growth of the next follicle for the next ovulation. So during the menstrual cycle, so this is what's happening in the uterus. So during the menstrual cycle, here's day 1. This is indicating the menstrual period. So the sloughing of the endometrium and out the vaginal canal, that's the menstrual period. And again, this is based on a 28-day cycle. So this is like a 5-day menstrual period. Not everybody has a 5-day menstrual period, but this is just our example. By day 5, we have a proliferative phase where we start to rebuild what we just lost. And those new follicles are developing with that FSH here. And once that estrogen and progesterone start to rise, that FSH is going to drop off. So it essentially, remember that meiosis 1 is almost complete before puberty. It finishes right before ovulation. And so we don't have a lot of steps to go through in meiosis 1 before that is 23 chromosomes ready to be ovulated. I think it arrests in prophase 1. So you just have to go through metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, which happens super, super fast. So we only have a very small window here just to mature that follicle, just kind of push it over the edge to finish meiosis 1 so it can be ovulated. So FSH is going to drop off when meiosis 1 basically completes, and then estrogens and progesterones are going to rise. Now notice how estrogen is very high right before that LH surge, or right around the time of that LH surge. Estrogen has a negative feedback and a positive feedback mechanism with it. So estrogen not only can inhibit LH and FSH, but it can also be the driving force for that LH surge in terms of ovulation. So it has kind of both types of feedback mechanisms that it can do. During that proliferative phase, again, we're rebuilding that endometrial lining at day 14. We have ovulation, and then we have what's called the secretory phase, which is when this endometrium becomes very cushy and vascular. Look at all the vascularity here for a blood supply to potentially keep an embryo alive. And then here at the end, this isn't shown in this image, this is from a newer text, but just a couple days right before the period is when the premenstrual phase occurs. And that's just essentially kind of this blood supply getting kind of cut off and suffocated. And then that causes these dead cells to kind of slough off in the next menstruation. So that's kind of how that menstrual cycle occurs. Let's see, something that might be interesting to some of you before I wrap up here is like birth control. We're not going to go into birth control in a lot of detail. Your book has a section on it, but something that's really interesting is if you're on the pill, a lot of pills are either just estrogen or just progesterone, or they're a combination of the two. And you can imagine that those in doses will inhibit FSH and LH, even though estrogen will have, you may ovulate on just an estrogen only, but if you are on the estrogen progesterone, chances are you're not ovulating on the pill. And if you're not ovulating, then you don't have the chance to get pregnant, as long as you take it regularly. If you skip a pill, this goes away, right? And then we have that FSH, LH surging, and then you will ovulate and you could get pregnant. That's how people get pregnant on the pills, because they're not routine with it. They don't take it at the same time. They don't take it every day. So that's just kind of interesting. IUDs work a little bit different, but there are some hormonal IUDs that also secrete these types of hormones as well. But anyway, that wraps up our last lecture of this class. So I hope you all enjoyed. Please let me know if you have any questions.